The briefing room in Inverness smelled of damp wool and cold coffee, the combination James Carter had learned to associate with cases that didn't end cleanly. Detective William Graves stood at the front with his broad hands flat on the table and a photograph pinned to the board behind him. A retired environmental surveyor named Thomas Elliot, 53, missing for 72 hours in the Cairngorms. His vehicle at the Linn of D car park. His border collie found wandering alone 4 miles east. Temperature last night -4. Tonight the same. Graves looked around the room with the particular stillness of a man whose stillness had always done more work than other men's words. "We are past the window," he said, "where this ends well on its own." Scout sat beside James's chair with his chin on his forepaws, resting his body while keeping everything else running. James watched Graves' face and let the details arrive. Thomas Elliot had a face in the photograph that belonged to the Highlands, weathered, open, the face of a man for whom the outdoors was not recreation but life. A man who knew these hills. Whatever had gone wrong in a way he hadn't anticipated. Which meant it could go wrong for the team too. Scout raised his head and looked at James. James looked back. Something passed between them that had no name and needed none. They left Inverness at 11:15. The Highland darkness thickened around them as they drove south toward Braemar, the road narrowing as the land rose and the Cairngorms began asserting themselves against the edges of the headlights. Constable Sarah Okafor drove without talking, which James appreciated. 8 years working the Highlands had given her the understanding that silence before an operation was not awkward, it was necessary. She had glanced at the forecast before leaving and said nothing about it, which told James everything about the forecast that saying something would have said less efficiently. The cold at the Linn of D car park hit them the moment the doors opened, not the soft cold of an English winter but the specific physical cold of the Scottish Highlands at altitude in November, the kind that found every gap in your clothing within 30 seconds and made itself at home there. James clipped Scout's working lead and watched the transformation happen as it always happened. The shift from companion to colleague. From the animal that pressed his flank against James's leg in the car to the animal that stood now at the edge of the car park with his nose reading the darkness with the focused intensity of a system coming fully online. Graves spread his map across the bonnet of the lead vehicle, torch held low. Elliot's favorite route, northeast through the old Scots pine stands, following the D for the first mile, then cutting up onto the plateau. 3 pairs. James and Scout on the northeast route with Elliot's sent from the gear in the boot. Okafor and McPherson on the eastern ridge. Graves and Reed along the river. Radio check every 20 minutes. Scout is our best chance of finding him alive, Graves said, and his eyes found James with the directness of a man saying one thing and meaning it entirely. Stay with the scent. James knelt beside Scout and held the evidence bag containing Elliot's scarf to the dog's nose. Scout dropped his head and breathed it in long, deliberate inhalations, reading it the way you'd read the first page of something important. Then he lifted his head. Ears fully forward. Body oriented northeast with the quiet absolute certainty of a compass finding north. James looked at that certainty and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since the briefing room. Whatever else the night held, this was real. The Cairngorms forest received them immediately and completely. The ancient Scots pines closed overhead and the darkness became layered, not the single register darkness of a room with the lights off but a darkness with depth and texture and its own quality of presence. The ground underfoot was soft with decades of pine needle accumulation, each step muffled before it could travel. The smell was the smell of the Highlands being itself when nobody was watching. Cold pine resin, peat earth, the mineral sharpness of the burn to their left, the deep organic smell of things living and things decomposing simultaneously. Scout moved with purpose from the first step. Not exploration, commitment. James could feel the difference in the lead, the particular tension that meant the scent was real and present and Scout was on it completely. They moved northeast for 30 minutes before James's radio check with Graves returned only static. He changed frequencies. Tried the emergency backup. A single broken syllable that resolved into nothing. The terrain above had closed around whatever signal had been reaching them. James stood in the forest dark with a dead radio and a man's life somewhere ahead and made the only decision that his conscience would allow. They kept going. The treeline fell back as the ground steepened and the plateau edge arrived. The sky suddenly present above them, vast and dark and scattered with stars, the wind arriving at the same moment with the full force of open highland ground behind it. Scout stopped at the plateau edge and spent 30 seconds reading the open air in a wide arc, his nose working through everything the wind was carrying with the systematic thoroughness of an instrument running a full diagnostic. Then he moved right, east along the plateau edge, and James followed. 15 minutes later, James's footing failed him. A section of heather bank undercut at its edge, frost-hardened surface over soft substrate, his left boot finding the deception and going through it, his weight going sideways, the slope taking him in the deliberate way that slopes take people when the conditions are exactly wrong. He stopped 20 feet below the plateau edge, wedged against a heather root mass old enough and dense enough to hold him. Inventory, both hands functional, left ankle twisted but bearing weight, ribs bruised, torch gone, radio housing cracked against something on the way down. He pressed transmit. Nothing. Not even static. He looked up. Scout was at the plateau edge above him, the pale shape of the dog's chest against the slightly lighter sky, looking down with the focused attention of an animal assessing a situation it had not encountered in this configuration before. James waited for the trained distress bark. Scout did not bark. He looked at James for a long moment in complete silence. Then he looked right, along the top of the bank. Then back at James. Then right again. The message was clear and required no translation. James traversed the slope carefully, using the heather for handholds, Scout moving along the top of the bank above him and keeping pace until the bank shallowed and James pulled himself back up to the plateau surface. He knelt on the frost-hardened heather and took stock of what actually existed now versus what had been supposed to exist. No torch. No working radio. A twisted ankle that would slow him. The open Cairngorms plateau at 1:20 in the morning in November. And Scout, sitting beside him through all of it, not restless, not anxious, simply present and waiting with the absolute patience of an animal that had made its assessment and was prepared to hold it for as long as the human beside him needed to finish thinking. James looked at his partner in the darkness. The pale shape of his chest. The complete absence of panic in every line of him. "All right," James said quietly, his breath making a small cloud in the cold air. "Your call." Scout stood immediately and oriented north, deeper into the plateau, into the open ground where the wind came without obstruction and the temperature was at its most serious. James stood with him and followed. For 20 minutes Scout tracked clearly and James felt it in the lead, the focused committed movement of a dog following a thread through a world of information. But then something shifted. The nose that had been reading the ground began reading the air, high and consistently, not the general wind scenting of a dog establishing a location but something more sustained and more specific than that. The pace changed too, not slower but more deliberate, the difference between walking to a destination you know and moving toward something you can hear but not yet see. James watched it and said nothing and turned it over in his mind without finding a category for it in 6 years of working experience. Scout stopped. The sudden complete stop that James had learned to treat as instruction. Head up. Nose fixed on a single point to the northeast with the concentrated attention of an instrument locked onto a signal. James stopped with him and looked northeast into total darkness. He held his breath. Listened past the wind. It came at the very edge of perception, almost not a sound, existing in the uncertain territory between what the ear could confirm and what the mind wanted to hear. Faint. Irregular. Not wind. Not any of the plateau's ordinary nighttime sounds. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck respond before his mind had finished processing what he was hearing. Scout moved forward. Not the pace he had been using all night. Something slower and more deliberate, each step placed with a care that James had never seen in him before. Not the caution of a frightened animal. The caution of an animal that understood that what lay ahead required approach in a particular way and was choosing that way with full intention. And then Scout did something that stopped James completely. He sat down. In the middle of the open plateau. In the wind and the cold. and looked at James with an expression that James would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and never quite managing. Not urgency. Not appeal. Something quieter and stranger. Something that said, in the language of 6 years of partnership, what is ahead is not what you are expecting. Go carefully. Go quietly. And when you find it, understand it before you react. James crouched in front of Scout and put his hand on the dog's chest and felt the heartbeat there, steady, strong, the calm measured rhythm of an animal completely present and completely certain. He looked into Scout's eyes in the darkness and found what he always found there, something between intelligence and wisdom, something built from 6 years of shared decisions and mutual trust that had constructed, one choice at a time, this particular partnership and no other. "All right," James said. The word that meant, "I'm with you. Whatever you know, I trust it. Show me." Scout rose, turned northeast, and moved forward into whatever the night had been keeping. What Scout had found was not what James had been looking for. That was the first thing James understood, not gradually, not through a process of reasoning, but all at once, in the single second that his eyes adjusted to what was in front of him and his mind caught up to what his eyes were reporting. He had come onto the plateau looking for a missing man. What Scout had led him to was a hollow, a natural depression in the plateau surface where the peat had subsided over decades into a rough oval perhaps 4 meters across and 2 meters deep, its edges overgrown with heather that leaned inward over the rim and created a partial natural roof on the windward side. The kind of place the plateau made for its own reasons and that appeared on no map and that a man who had walked these hills for 30 years might know about and file away in the back of his mind under the category of places that might matter someday. Thomas Elliot was inside it. He was alive. That was the second thing James understood, and the relief of it moved through him with a physical force that he hadn't been prepared for, a release of something he hadn't known he was holding until it let go. Elliot was on his side in the hollow, his back against the peat wall on the sheltered side, his knees drawn up, his body in the particular compressed posture of a person who has spent a long time trying to retain heat with nothing but their own body to retain it with. He was wearing his walking gear, good gear, experienced gear, the choices of someone who knew the hills, but 72 hours at these temperatures had done their arithmetic on him regardless. He was conscious. Barely. His eyes opened when Scout reached the rim of the hollow and then opened further when James appeared beside the dog, and the expression in them was one James had seen before in people who had been at the outer edge of what the body could manage and had just been pulled back from it. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the particular fragile awareness of someone who has just understood that they are going to survive something they had stopped believing they would survive. Scout went into the hollow without hesitation. He went directly to Elliot and pressed his broad, warm body against the man's chest, not the cautious approach of an animal uncertain of its reception but the deliberate, purposeful movement of an animal that understood exactly what was needed and was providing it. Warmth. Presence. Elliot's hand came up slowly and found Scout's coat and held on with the grip of a man who has been alone in the cold for 3 days and has just found something warm and alive and real. James slid into the hollow beside them. He put his hands on Elliot's face, checking temperature, checking responsiveness, running the assessment his training had given him for exactly this situation. Elliot's skin was cold but not the dangerous cold of someone whose core temperature had crossed the threshold. His eyes were tracking. His speech, when it came, was slow and slightly slurred but coherent, the speech of a man who was cold and exhausted and had been frightened for a long time but whose mind was still working. "Fell?" Elliot said, the single word carrying everything. James looked at his legs and saw what the word meant. The left ankle at an angle that explained the hollow, explained the 3 days, explained everything. He had come onto the plateau on his usual route, had fallen in the dark, had made it to this hollow that he knew from 30 years of walking these hills, and had been here since. Unable to walk. Unable to summon help. Waiting. "You found the hollow on purpose?" James said. Elliot looked at him with eyes that were exhausted but not empty. "Knew it was here," he said. 30 years. The pause. Thought someone would come. Another pause, quieter. Stopped thinking that yesterday. James pulled the emergency foil blanket from his jacket pocket, standard equipment, always carried, never previously needed with this degree of urgency, and wrapped it around Elliot's shoulders. He pulled his own jacket off and added it across Elliot's legs. The cold hit him immediately through his base layer, but he had been moving and his core temperature was good and Elliot's was not, and the mathematics of that were simple. Scout had not moved from Elliot's side. He lay pressed against the man's chest with the patient steadiness of an animal that understood its role in this moment with complete clarity and was fulfilling it without drama or hesitation. The warmth Scout was generating was not incidental. It was the difference between a man whose temperature was stable and a man whose temperature was still falling. James watched Elliot's hand move slowly across Scout's coat and watched some of the rigid tension in the man's body begin, very gradually, in increments too small to observe individually but accumulating into something visible, to release. James looked at Scout. Scout looked back at him over Elliot's shoulder with those dark, steady eyes. James held that look for a moment and thought about the plateau. The moment Scout had stopped tracking and started doing something else, something James had no name for. The moment Scout had sat down in the wind and the cold and looked at him with that expression that was not urgency and not appeal but something quieter and more specific than either. He thought about what that expression had been saying, what Scout had known on the plateau that James had not known. Not just that Elliot was here. Something more than that. The particular quality of what was here. A man alone and cold who had stopped believing anyone would come, and the particular quality of what was needed. Not speed. Not tactical response. Quiet. The kind of approach that said to a man at the edge of what he could bear, "You are found. You are not alone anymore. It is over now." Scout had known that before James had chosen his pace and his approach accordingly. Had sat James down in the middle of the plateau to make sure he understood it too before they arrived. James put his hand on Scout's head briefly, one warm moment of contact in the cold, and then he began the practical work of getting Thomas Elliot off this plateau. The ascent from the hollow to the plateau surface took 10 minutes and cost Elliot significant pain that he bore with the particular silent dignity of a man who had been managing pain for 3 days and had found his relationship with it. James supported his weight on the left side, Elliot's arm across his shoulders, moving in the careful incremental way that two people move when one of them cannot bear their own weight and the other cannot afford to lose their footing. Scout moved ahead of them and then circled back and then moved ahead again. Not tracking now, not alerting, but doing something that James recognized after the third repetition as checking. Moving ahead to read the ground, returning to confirm they were managing, moving ahead again. A pattern that had no name in any training manual James had read but that was unmistakably intentional and unmistakably useful. The plateau in the dark without a torch was navigated entirely by Scout. James kept one hand on Elliot and his attention on the pale shape of Scout moving ahead of them in the darkness, reading the dog's choices of line and trusting them completely. When Scout moved left, James moved left. When Scout slowed, James slowed. When Scout paused and looked back, James stopped and waited until Scout moved again. The communication between them required no words and no signals. It operated in the register of 6 years of partnership, in the frequency that Martha Ogilvy back in Harrow's Bend had once described without knowing she was describing the most important thing about them, the frequencies other people couldn't hear. They had been moving for perhaps 30 minutes when James heard something ahead that was not wind and was not Scout and was not the plateau's ordinary nighttime sounds. A voice. Then 2 voices. Then torchlight cutting through the darkness 50 meters ahead, sweeping, searching, the movement of people who were looking for something and had not yet found it. James felt something release in his chest that had been held tight since the radio had gone dead. He raised his voice against the wind. The torches swung toward them. And then Graves was there, William Graves, who never ran, who moved through every situation with the same measured pace, running across the heather toward them with a quality of relief on his face that James had never seen there before and that transformed it into something more human and more open than the face James knew from briefing rooms and case files. "Carter." Graves reached them and his eyes went immediately to Elliot, assessing, professional, the relief not gone but filed behind the immediate priorities of someone who was already calculating what came next. "Thomas Elliot." Not a question. His hand went to Elliot's other side, taking some of the weight, and James felt his own body register the assistance with a gratitude that was entirely physical. We lost your signal 40 minutes ago. Okafor picked up your emergency locator at the plateau edge. Your radio must have activated the beacon when it cracked. He looked at James. You found him. Still not a question. The evidence was in front of him. Scout found him, James said. Graves looked at the dog. Scout sat beside Elliot in the torchlight with the same patient steadiness he had shown through every hour of the night, unhurried, undemonstrative, completely present. Graves was not a sentimental man. He had worked the Highlands for 20 years and had seen enough to have filed most things in categories that did not require new vocabulary. But he looked at Scout for a moment longer than the situation strictly required, and something moved across his face that was not in any of his usual categories, and he said nothing about it, which was perhaps the most genuine response available to him. The paramedics took Elliot at the car park. Hypothermia, the fractured ankle, dehydration, 72 hours of exposure that he had survived through a combination of experience and stubbornness and the particular shelter of a hollow that 30 years of walking had put in his memory for exactly this kind of need. They said he would be fine. They said it with the measured confidence of people who had seen what not fine looked like and could tell the difference. James stood beside the ambulance and watched them work and felt the specific exhaustion that arrives when the thing you have been holding yourself together for is finally, completely, over. Scout sat beside him, pressed against his leg. The same contact he had maintained for 6 years in the car, in the briefing room, at the end of operations that had gone well and operations that had not. James put his hand on Scout's head and felt the warmth of him, the solid, living warmth of an animal that had been in the cold all night and was warm anyway, the way he was always warm, the way he was always present. James kept his hand there and said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. There was nothing that words would have improved. Graves appeared beside him, stood there for a moment in the particular silence of a man who has something to say and is choosing how to say it. The locator beacon in your radio housing, he said finally. It activated when the housing cracked. The pause. Standard issue. Designed to activate on impact. Another pause. You didn't know it was there. It was not a question, but it had a question inside it. The question of how James had decided to keep going after the radio failed, how he had made the choice that protocol said not to make, how Thomas Elliot had come off that plateau alive tonight instead of being found tomorrow in a hollow in the Cairngorms that appeared on no map. James looked at Scout. I had better information than protocol, he said. Graves followed his gaze. Scout sat in the car park light with his ears slightly forward and his nose reading the cold night air with the mild, interested attention of an animal that had finished its work and was simply present now in the aftermath of it. Not celebrating, not resting dramatically, just there, just himself, just Scout. Graves watched him for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else but that contained, James thought, more acknowledgement than most of Graves' sentences managed. He walked back toward the vehicles without another word. Sarah Okafor brought James a flask of tea from somewhere, hot, strong, the particular tea that only tastes exactly right when you have been cold for several hours and are no longer cold. James drank it standing in the car park with Scout beside him and the ambulance lights turning slowly in the darkness behind them and the Cairngorms rising black and enormous against the sky above the treeline. He thought about the plateau. The hollow. The sound that had been almost not a sound. Scout sitting down in the middle of the open ground and looking at him with that expression he still didn't have a word for. He thought about Thomas Elliot's hand, finding Scout's coat in the dark of the hollow and holding on. He thought about 30 years of walking hills that then saved your life because you had been paying attention all along, building the map in your memory that would matter when the map in your pocket was useless. He thought about 6 years of partnership and the 1,000 small moments of trust that had built, without anyone planning them, into the thing that had operated on the plateau tonight. The thing that had no name in any training manual and that no amount of formal instruction could have produced, that could only be built the way it had been built, one decision at a time, one choice to follow rather than override, one accumulated understanding that when Scout stopped it was worth asking why. He finished the tea. Scout looked up at him. The dark eyes, steady and unhurried, holding whatever they always held. The Scottish dawn was still hours away. But the sky above the Cairngorms was doing its first imperceptible work. the black beginning its long slow shift toward the deep blue that came before everything else, so gradual you could only confirm it by looking away and looking back. James looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Scout. Scout was already looking at him. "Come on then," James said quietly. And they walked toward the car together, the way they always walked, in the particular step that 6 years had made their own, the officer and his dog, the man and his partner, moving through the cold Highland dark toward whatever came next.